Here's a guy who wants to gish-gallop a bunch of easy questions to atheists.
Why is there something rather than nothing?
Why would there be nothing? Why are we assuming nothing to be a default state of reality and something to be in need of explanation? Nothingness seems to be a complete abstraction. It's just an idea and not something that should be considered a default.
Is there any evidence that suggests the universe is eternal?
It depends on what you mean by eternal, but since the matter in the universe was clearly more densely concentrated in the past, and since time passes more slowly around dense concentrations of matter, that corroborates the idea that if time were to run backwards, it would approach the Big Bang asymptotically. In other words, the farther back in the past, the more slow time was, and maybe the speed of the passage of time at the Big Bang was infinitesimally slow, and in that sense, the universe has been around eternally. I don't think there is proof of this, but the fact that the universe was denser in the past is evidence. But even if the universe were not eternal, that wouldn't make it contingent upon a god.
If not, why do atheists hold on to this idea and say that you have debunked the Kalam?
Well, the assumption that the universe has a beginning is the least of the Kalam's problems. The idea that all things which begin to exist have a cause is hard to reconcile with relativity, which says that all points in time are equally part of reality, rather than entering reality only after some prior cause. And thus the universe didn't come into existence at its earliest moment any more than a yardstick comes into existence at its first inch. If it didn't come into existence, then nothing needed to cause it to come into existence.
If so, why do the vast majority of scientists reject this idea?
Citation needed on that one, but again, even if the universe was not eternal, that doesn't mean it necessarily had a cause.
Why is the universe so fine-tuned?
It only looks fine-tuned if you compare the parameters it has to the scope of the parameters we can imagine it to have. The fact that we can imagine the universe with different parameters doesn't mean that these other parameters were ever actually possible. We don't know that the universe's constants have ever been free to vary. Also, why would an all-powerful God need to fine-tune a universe for us to live in it? Shouldn't an all-powerful God be able to put life in any universe? And isn't God himself alive? If God created the universe, that implies that he is capable of existing without any universe, let alone a finely tuned one. So he's at least one life form that doesn't need a finely tuned universe to exist.
If your answer is the multiverse, why is there no evidence for this theory?
Well, that depends on which multiverse you're talking about. Brian Greene mentions 9 different kinds of multiverse in his book, The Hidden Reality. One of them is the quantum multiverse of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and there's lots of evidence for that one.
Is it possible that there is no natural explanation for the origin of life?
I don't think life just appeared randomly for no reason and with no explanation at all. But I suppose you probably mean to ask whether it's possible that there is a supernatural explanation. To that I say no, not really. The supernatural is not really an explanation at all. To say that something happened magically, or God did it, doesn't tell us anything of substance about how it happened. It's not an explanation. Even if a God created the universe, an explanation would have to tell us what that means exactly and by what mechanisms it happened.
Where does consciousness come from?
It's a software program run by the brain.
Do you lack a belief that God exists, or would you say that God does not exist?
That depends on several definitions. It depends on what definition of God you're using. It depends even on what you mean when you say that something exists. If you define God as a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind, as some apologists do, and you define existence as having extension or location in space-time, as I do, then I think it's safe to say that such a God does not exist, since to say it exists would be a contradiction. With respect to most other definitions of God and existence, I probably simply lack a belief.
Do you just lack a belief that Zeus exists, or do you believe that Zeus does not exist?
I don't know what a Greek theologian would tell me about the ontology of Zeus, so I don't really know what it means to say that he exists. Given that this is the case, I guess I only lack a belief that he exists.
If you just lack a belief that Zeus exists, why are you centuries behind the rest of the world who says that Zeus does not exist?
Well, I don't think that many people have really thought about what it means to say that Zeus does or does not exist, and are just assuming he doesn't exist because most other people do. You see, that's the problem with ad populum arguments.
Do you act according to what you believe, or what you just lack a belief in?
I act according to what I believe, I guess, but I don't understand what that has to do with whether a god exists.
What evidence is there that atheism corresponds with reality?
Well, insofar as by atheism you mean the idea that a god does not exist, the fact that reality looks as though there is no god in it is evidence of that. Everything seems capable of developing and functioning on its own, without a conscious creator.
Is atheism a worldview? If not, what is your worldview?
If you mean the kind of atheism that says there is no God, then I think that's a worldview. With respect to my worldview, that depends on what aspects of the world we're talking about. I suppose most broadly, I believe that contemporary scientific methods are the most effective at finding ways of thinking about experience that most reliably predict future experiences.
What would convince you that God exists?
First, I would need to hear a definition of God that isn't self-contradictory, like the timeless, spaceless one. Then I would need to see evidence of that God that is more parsimoniously explained by the idea that such a God exists than by any other explanation I could conceive.
Are you willing to follow the evidence, wherever it leads, even if it leads to a different understanding of how the universe works?
Of course, any understanding I will ever have of how the universe works is going to be informed by the evidence.
If Jesus rose from the dead, would you become a Christian?
No, rising from the dead does not, in itself, make a person worthy of worship. It certainly doesn't make a person a god. Rising from the dead is an impressive power, but having that one impressive power does not mean that a person is all-powerful.
If you wouldn't become a Christian, why would you ever accept the fact that he rose from the dead?
Because proving that someone rose from the dead is different from proving that someone is a god or is worthy of worship. Proving one does not prove the other. In fact, as improbable as it would be, inferring that he had some advanced extraterrestrial technology would be a far smaller leap of logic than inferring that he is a god.
Why do atheists keep insisting that faith is blind trust, when that's not what Christians or the Bible say?
In Hebrews 11:1, the Bible says that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. What is blind trust if it's not assurance of what you don't see?
Why do you want material evidence for an immaterial God?
What other kind of evidence is there? I don't know where to even start looking for immaterial evidence. What would that even look like? What would it mean for the immaterial to be evident?
Is there a purpose to life?
Not unless you give it one.
If there is, by what standard do you determine that life has purpose?
I don't determine that life has a purpose. A purpose has to be invented.
If not, what is the point of listening to this video?
Satisfying my curiosity about what these questions were going to be.
Where does morality come from?
Our consciences.
How do you determine what is right and what is wrong?
Right and wrong are whatever my conscience tells me they are.
When a lion kills a cub from another pride, because that's what natural selection has raised it to do, is that morally acceptable?
Well, what's the alternative? Sending people to watch over every lion population to make sure that they're behaving themselves? That seems like it would be far more harmful to their ecosystem.
If evolution has put a sense of morality into us to help us survive, what makes our actions better than any other animal's actions?
Well, sometimes people act in a way that is less offensive to my conscience than the way other animals act, but not always. But ultimately, what I consider morally better or morally worse is whatever my conscience tells me.
Is it morally acceptable for you to kill a toddler because you can no longer financially support it?
Well, obviously not, because there are many alternative options that don't violate anyone's bodily autonomy.
Is it morally acceptable for you to kill a fetus in the womb because you could not financially support it?
Well, what's the alternative? Forcing someone to give birth against their will? That's far worse.
Is it morally acceptable to kill a baby after it's been born? How can you morally differentiate between a baby in the womb at 6 months and a baby born prematurely at 6 months?
One affects another person's body and the other doesn't.
Who was Jesus?
He was a dude from Nazareth.
Why did his disciples say that he rose from the dead?
Religion is a hell of a drug.
Why does the Bible keep lining up with archaeology?
It doesn't. For example, the Sinai ought to be littered with Israelite artifacts corroborating the 40 years that Exodus says they wandered around the place. But Israeli archaeologists haven't found the tiniest bit of evidence of their presence.
Why do the three bloodiest regimes in history, that being Mao's China, Nazi Germany, and Stalin's Russia, come from atheistic ideas?
Which ideas would those be in particular? None of those leaders ever said, we need to ban democracy because there is no God. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.